Welcome to Life on Life's Terms. It's your host, Justin, and we have a reoccurring guest, our lawyer here at Life on Life's Terms, Liam Connolly. And the topics that we're going to get into today is, where did restorative justice come from? What are the current uses in the Canadian restorative justice system? And how do we transform it? How do we transform the measures of restorative justice to help with behavioral issues and some of the models that we might be able to steal from? So, how are you doing this morning, Liam?
Well, it's nice to be back behind the big microphone again.
Yeah, I like to call it the electric dick.
Oh, dear.
That's just me, though.
I just got an Eddie Rabbit song in my head. Electric Avenue, Electric Dick. Okay.
Everybody, we get some of the guests that have come in, they feel fine until they're sitting in front of this microphone and they go, oh yeah, this just became all too real. And you can hear their mouth go dry. And you're like, need some water?
Well, I could do the Justin Trudeau.
Jesus Christ! Yeah, there goes all the listeners into the ditch. The show went. So, let's get into where restorative justice came from and current models, and we'll let you just go.
Okay. Well, this isn't. I teach at Athabasca University, and actually, I teach jurisprudence, and I've been getting more and more into this whole area of restorative justice and looking at it because, well, my background, I used to do a lot of criminal defense work and still do. And so now I'm kind of looking at the system and I'm looking at it through my academic eyes and going, what we're doing sucks.
Yeah.
And so, I always try to find, are there better ways of doing things? What do we have? Where are we going? And some of my reading has actually taken me through some interesting things by, some books by Howard Zerr and Suntzman and Kay and some of the other ones. I'm starting to understand some of the work that they're doing in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. But where I'm going to be talking with a bit of a broad brush right now, and maybe a bit about some of the stuff happening in BC. Mainly because of the work with the Indigenous community that's happening there with the restorative justice programs and what they're doing. So if we actually think about this, restorative justice probably is a response to a retributive justice system, where in retributive justice we're talking about inflicting pain against the offender.
That's right, yeah.
You have caused an offense against the public. Our whole criminal justice system, the criminal code is set up as these are public offenses.
Yeah.
So we're trying to, it's the state is punishing the offender. Mm-hmm. And when we get into that, so the idea is about pain, it's, trying, and of course nowadays we get so many people that want to say, oh, we need harsher sentences and all these other things. And I'm going, okay, very nice, and we're going to build more jails that'll be how much cost, et cetera, et cetera. And I go, that's getting stupid, because it's going to cost more and more as we try to say we should have longer sentences, we should have harsher sentences. But are we really dealing with the problem? And where I start to get into this is I say restorative justice is that sort of unique response to crimes. And if I go back in the history, like I'm kind of colored by some of my studies in my early days. I've worked with Renata Moore and Susan Edwards and stuff out in BC. And done some study, I was a student under them, and we talked about sentencing reform and everything else. And so I can kind of look at the history and go, we've had a criminal justice system whereby many people, ancient times, 18th, 19th century, where a lot of things were capital offenses. Mm-hmm. We either, hung you or took your head off, as a way of showing our disapproval of your actions. Mm-hmm. And the idea there is inflicting pain upon the offender and also creating amongst the general public of, oh my God, I shouldn't do that because this is what could happen to me.
Yeah.
And we're in that mode. And I guess if we start to look through the history of it, we go, over time, that whole, we don't do public executions anymore because it became too commonplace.
Yeah.
And so it got overkill. It's overkill, pardon the pun.
Yeah.
But people, it lost its effect. Actually, do you know, the irony used to be in England, 18th century, pickpocketing was a capital offense.
Huh.
Guess where most of the pickpocketing occurred? Public hangings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Funny, right?
Yeah.
And so we get this sort of retributive justice as we start to develop this, and we try to, create this, and of course, what have we done? Is we're dealing with the offender. Then in the 70s and 80s, we start thinking about sentencing reform, and we start to think more about the actual offender in the whole picture. And trying in this whole idea of can we help them? Can we somehow deal with this recidivism? Can we start to rehabilitate? So we start to do this rehabilitation focus on the offender.
Mm-hmm.
And now the problem is, has that worked? Yes and no. But then since that hasn't been going well too, then the question is, but we're back to, let's get back to harsher sentences. We've been too soft on the offender. What's missing in this equation? The real victim.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where this whole mode of restorative justice is this response to what I call the failings of retributive justice system. And we start to now focus back on the victim and how the offender has affected the victim. So we've gone down this road, but there's still a problem with this equation, in that we can actually say, yes, the person, if we're dealing with the offender, now we're going and focusing on the victim. But we're still doing it within this what I call a retributive justice system that currently exists. And what we've really done is we've actually said the state is the victim.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've created this disconnect between the actual offender, the actual victims, the actual people involved, and the state has put itself in that place. And I would probably then say that this whole aspect now has been, with retributive justice, the theory was pain is the vindication by the public. Now with restorative, it's about what the vindication is the acknowledgement of the victim's harm.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is we're still doing it within a criminal code system that is about a public wrong. Mm-hmm. We're still dealing with the state being that, taking the place of the victim. And when we start to move now, we can talk about, a lot of myths and stuff in what I would call in restorative justice. So the question is now, what is it, right? And we can start to say restorative justice is not primarily about forgiveness or reconciliation. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily implying a return to past circumstances, mm-hmm. The idea of reconciliation, mm-hmm. Which, by the way, gets us into the whole aspect of a lot of the indigenous issues around the reconciliation process. And a lot of them say, well, if that's the case, then we're going back to what it was, but what it was not great. Mm-hmm. So really, it's not about reconciliation; it's about conciliation. We can get mm-hmm. into that. I could leave that for an entire whole segment mm-hmm. another day. Restorative justice is not about mediation either. We also get it's not restorative justice is not primarily designed to reduce recidivism or repeat offenses. And there's one part I would say it should be. Yeah. And if we think about, the idea of, we've got this person caught in a cycle, but really, who's the true victim, who's the true offender, mm-hmm. and how they're caught in that cycle. I'm going, that to me is a bit of a question mark of, I think, part of the thing they're missing mm-hmm. With restorative justice. Restorative justice is not limited to minor offenses or first-time offenses. However, most cases it really is, right?
Especially in Canada, yeah.
Especially, yeah, serious violent offenses, sexual offense. No, that the same thing doesn't apply there. So
Yeah.
we miss on those. Now, restorative justice is also not new or North American development. Actually, it's not. We can see a lot of this stuff in the history of it. Actually, is a unique response, and it does come from issues in terms of a lot of the indigenous community members and bringing people together. And I think we could learn from that, in that what they're able to do, and this gets into circles and everything else, is they're starting to reconnect the offender and the community. And instead of the state being in place of the community, the real community, the real people affected. And that, I think, is what's the best part about restorative justice, is that it now takes out the state, or it should.
Yeah.
Because then you can connect people again. And I think this disconnect has led us to a situation where the offender says, state, whatever, right? The courts and the system, it doesn't have any effect on them anymore. So they're kind of going like they're just, two sticky fingers upwards going, whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And because that disconnect between the real people in the community being affected and the public. I guess what it means is we've had we've had a wrong concept of who truly should be the public in these situations. So that kind of takes us to a bit more of, can we define restorative justice? And I'm going to kind of I'm just going to quote here in terms of this. How then should restorative justice be defined? Even though there is a general agreement on the basic outlines of restorative justice, those in the field have been unable to come to a consensus on its specific meaning. Some of us question the wisdom or usefulness of such a definition. While we recognize the need for principles and benchmarks, we worry about the arrogance and finality of establishing a rigid meaning. With these concerns in mind, I offer you this guy, and this is from Zer in terms of his piece. And he talks about restorative justice as an approach to achieving justice that involves, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in specific offenses or harm to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. So we can get into some of the goals of now of what is restorative justice, and in many cases, the core of this is, in terms of restorative justice programs, is to put the decisions back in the hands of those affected. So it's actually putting the true public back in place of the court system, make justice more healing and ideally more transformative. And I like that word, transformative, because that's truly what we're trying to do. We're trying to transform the offender from their current behaviors to one that society says, no, this is what we accept as proper behavior. And, of course, the idea, too, is to reduce the likelihood of further offenses. Now, one of the key things in terms of, I would probably say, about healing and being transformative, and this community idea of rules. I just want to set the stage on this one. We in jurisprudence, we look at where do rules come from? How does society create rules, and where do they get used? And I think we sometimes talk about how a custom becomes usage, which then has force of law. And it's that, the ruler the idea too, the ruler makes a rule, it's backed by threats. So you can start to see where fundamentally the concept of the punishment and retributive justice comes from in terms of that. And I think we have to start to turn that on its head and start to go back to, the true issue of where the community gets involved, and directly involved, rather than them abrogating that responsibility to the state and its court system.
Mm-hmm.
But because then we can start to reconnect the people in terms of a sense of community. And some people sort of say, well, is our community, what is our community status right now? It's crap, right?
Well, then
Probably because most of these cases are going. So that's kind of the background to it.
I think also it would help with the stigma, right? We have so much stigma behind ex-convicts, stigma about addicts, stigma about people who are reformed.
Mental health?
Yeah. So when we get to the community involved in a restorative justice model, so to say, we then break those barriers of stigma because now we're actually putting people in the same melting pot who like for instance, and this is just my personal story from being a recovered addict. I was with a men's fraternity, and when I told people that I have an addiction issue and I'm allergic to drugs and alcohol, I break out in handcuffs and stuff, which, is an old joke.
Yeah.
The biggest thing that you can see from those people today, they respect me more today because they can actually walk away and say, he's one in a million. He's the one guy that they can say to their family, you know what, I know an addict and he has reformed. There is hope, right? However, the consequences of my reform dictates to those people that the system in place is working. That's what they want to use as their argument. The reality is I'm one in a million because the system is too hard to utilize for reform, right? It's not working, and the only reason why we have the 4 to 8% non-recidivism rate, if we look at that as a context of people who continuously go along these shitty behaviors, right? So that 4 to 8% that we have, really that's showing you that the system itself is not being utilized in the capacity where we could have more outcome of me or people like me than the majority who keeps on going in this revolving door fashion, right? And I think that's the downside of having one as opposed to 1,000 of us talking.
And you see, I would look at that and say, as an academic, and say, okay, we can understand the problem and we see more of this revolving door. But then you look at that one odd person out and you go, okay, what was different?
Yeah.
What did they do differently? And how can we basically bottle it and use it over and over again?
Yeah.
Because the revolving door, people don't understand, again, the revolving door of, well, we have to have tougher penalties and all these other shit, and I'm going like, no.
That's pretty cool.
And I'm going, okay, and you're prepared to pay more taxes for that?
Yeah.
What if I showed you a way that maybe we can actually lower the costs and improve the society?
So
that's where we can get into it.
So to get back to that jail piece. So here in the Edmonton area, we just had a brand new Edmonton Remand Center built. So I'm going to break this down because I know we have a lot of American listeners, but it is law in Canada that if you are arrested, you must be put in front of bail within 24 hours or somebody who can give you bail within 24 hours of being arrested. What we are starting to see here in Edmonton is they call it overhaul, which means they could not get you in front of a JP or a justice of a peace within 24 hours, so they throw you in the remand center. This is completely illegal when it comes to our Canadian Constitution of Charter of Rights. You can't do that. You have, and we're seeing this also in Calgary.
Yeah.
Now, these are the numbers.
This is where the Jordan case and the
this,
rest.
This is mind-blowing, okay? So we have a brand new remand center that houses 2,200 people, okay? Conservative, that's a conservative number. 2,200 people is like a small Canadian town in perspective to like Americans. That's like a neighborhood for a lot of them, right? Regardless. This overhaul number in Calgary is 500. So they have 500 people daily who are never going to meet a JP, and they're going to get slammed into a jail or a remand center to see an actual crown justice, so an actual judge, in 48 to 72 hours. So when you get arrested, and I know this from the process of being arrested, they give you an opportunity. Do you want to go for bail in front of a JP, or do you want to wait 48 hours to go in front of a judge? And they tell you, a JP is not a real judge, and the judge is a real judge. And if you go in front of the JP, you don't get the judge in 48 hours. If you don't see the JP, you're going to get the judge in 48 hours. That's basically what they tell you.
Yep.
So now in Calgary, we have about 500 people not even getting the opportunity to see a JP. They just move them off into remand. Here in Edmonton, we have 2,000 people daily not getting the rights to go and see a JP. They just segue them into the remand center. So here we're talking about a cost of what jails cost. Okay, so it cost us how many millions of dollars to build that brand new Supermax, which that's the model it is. It's a Supermax prison for remanded people. They're not convicted. Let's get that straight and clear. They are not convicted at this moment.
Yeah.
We're putting 2,000 people into a Supermax environment without even a shot at going to the justice of the peace for bail. And we are then the state, who is supposedly the victim, is now saying, we don't make any money off people going to jail. Well, then why is it that we're sending so many people into the system? There has to be some sort of payment system that's going on in that jail system in order to segue people and not even give them the constitutional right of the Charter of Rights to see a JP within 24 hours of getting arrested. They just segue them in there. So what they're saying and what their actions are do not, in the practice of what they're doing, it just doesn't make any sense.
And this is what I'm saying is that disconnect of what retributive justice is supposed to be and the reality too of what we're getting. And then we're trying to meld in this restorative justice system over top of this mess.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to give out my underlying theory is that this whole process that we still see, I think, is nothing more than a colonialization of a segment of our society.
100%.
And I think, and this is where my theory and my work is starting to gel with, and because, the same aspects of what we did colonizing our indigenous, with the, reserves and everything else, I think has, basically morphed into this whole system. Because remember, who are the vast majority sitting up in the remand right now?
Yeah.
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 And basically we've recolonized them.
Mm-hmm.
And we've kept them in this.
Well,
and of course I would say, the whole aspect of you could then say this whole aspect of restorative justice, especially, one of the we'll talk about some of the processes that we use once the circles comes from indigenous roots, and it's almost like they're fighting back.
Yeah.
And I'm going, good on them.
Yeah.
And the problem is, I think there are still aspects of that fight back that still need to be fixed.
Yeah.
There's still some improvements that we can get into because of the levels of mental health and addictions and stuff that are in that community as a result of this colonialization that we put them into. And I know it's going to say, it's just, this is my working theory in terms of this. But we'll see where it goes as I develop this further. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of talk about some of the processes that we use in restorative justice, and then we can go from there. In terms of these processes, we do have specific ways. Now there's peacemaking circles. These are basically methods of dialogue where you can listen, each side can listen to the other without judgment, without sense of shame or these sort of things. And, it's basically where the person can then tell their life stories and become naturally transforming.
So where we see that utilized today is drug court.
Yeah.
Uses that. So when you're in drug court, the client, I air quote client, it's actually the offender who's already pleaded guilty to be in drug court in the Canadian system. Americans will start rolling their eyes. They're probably going to do about 360 laps in their eyes as I'm saying this. And we also do that in victim services.
Yeah.
So in victim services, what that basically is here in Canada is you go to victim services and you are an actual victim. They find your offender and they can do the conversation back and forth. It's not in a group context. It's with the offender, the victim, and a police officer and a counselor. All in the same room, right? So I guess it's like a 4-person circle, you know? In drug court, it's many people in that room that are talking about their life stories of addiction and some of the behavioral issues that came from prior to or during active addiction, right? So and that's where that's utilized today.
And our problem, though, is what have we done with drug court?
Well, we'll get into that.
We've kind of stopped that.
We'll go into what drug court actually looks like in Canada
now. We're currently, and it's, and I think the key thing there too is from I would look at too from the offender side. You know, these circles when they can start to talk about their addictions and their issues. Maybe the light will start to go on for them. You never know. You can get into that sort of. Oh my God, then they start to realize.
Now, there's two sides to this. And I think that the one side on the offender is they get to actually see the depth of their offense.
Yeah.
Now, the con is this. The offender may not be all that honest because they feel that a judiciary who's sitting in that room may use what they've said against them. Because you also have the victim and the judge sitting in the room.
And that's where I say we're still back to this odd part of the retributive justice system of the infliction of pain.
That's right.
Still is part of it, messing it up.
That's right.
It's not creating the perfect picture for what you actually are trying to achieve.
That's right.
So the other one is, and I remember I said, restorative justice is not about mediation. No, it's interesting that there is a restorative form of mediation, though it's not exclusively associated with the formal system. You know, kind of like what we have of pretrial and stuff with small claims. That's where we do have a mediation process for the parties where they can actually start to get into what was actually going on. The mediation can be used prior to a charge, prior to sentencing, or after sentencing. The process can also take place while an offender is incarcerated or as part of a parole or a probation process. So they have this, but it's all part and parcel of this colonialization, retributive justice system. So that it's still not gotten away from it. And if you're not going to get away from that which is not working, guess what you're doing? You're further messing it up, right?
So here in Canada, where we see that predominantly used is in diversion court.
Yeah.
That's exactly what the court, and now we're starting to see a mental health court, which is also utilizing that theory or that kind of projection.
But even the stuff in terms of the mental health court, they're still saying, well, it's not really about. It's not the same diversion process.
That's right.
They had. Right?
That's right. So let's break down. I'm going to break down diversion court a little bit more. So diversion court is typically your first or second offense. You have to be an adult for a diversion court, and you cannot have a prior conviction as a juvenile. If you have a prior conviction as a juvenile, you are not allowed into diversion court. So you're 18, you got caught, shoplifting at a grocery store or something, and next thing you know, you get summons to court. So you have a PTA. Here in Canada, that means promise to appear. You appear to court, and this person sitting at the desk says, hey, guess what? You're eligible for diversion court. So then you go into diversion court. You are still going to claim guilty. And then what they do is they stay your charges for a year. They give you your community service and your probation. You walk out, you complete those things, and then your charges are swiped. Typically, and that's not all the time, but that's typically diversion court. Right? Now, the criteria to get into diversion court is very, very difficult. Most people who are going into court are usually recidivists. I mean, let's look at the stat is real. 94% on a good year is recidivist.
And but the thing is, it's meant to be as an issue dealing with first or second offenses.
That's right.
Same as with the medical discharge for an impaired.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And I've run those ones. I remember one time in one of the cases I had with I got a medical discharge with the client. And actually, the Crown sort of stops and goes, yeah, this is what this section was meant for. It's like, yeah.
Yeah.
And the judge then sort of looked at the Crown and says, you're okay with it? He says, yeah, I'm good with that. Yeah, let's do it.
Curative discharge.
Yeah, and we actually walked through everything, and the judge and everybody in the courtroom, and everyone kind of went like, yeah, this is what we should be doing with it. It was kind of like a light bulb moment. It's like, and, to me, I look at, stuff I've done in the criminal justice system, and I go, that was one of those shining little moments that sticks in your mind, and you're going like, something actually worked for a change.
Yeah.
Rather than getting hooped, the client getting hooped and just, ending up with a, record and everything else. Yeah.
And getting nailed. Yeah.
Yeah. And then tagged for the rest of their life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the other thing too. Here in the process in Canada, we don't have a pardons anymore. We have what's called a temporary. We have temporary forgiveness. Is what it's called now.
Expungement. Yeah.
Well, we used to have expungement.
Yeah, that's right.
And then it went to pardons.
Yeah.
And then from pardons, now what we have is called a temporary. It's called a temporary forgiveness.
Yep.
Which means you're never forgiven.
No.
It's always going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
It costs you a lot more money to get it.
Yeah.
And they can still see it.
Yeah.
Whereas an expungement was completely gone. A pardon meant it was there, but it can never be used unless you reoffended. And now the temporary forgiveness means, well, it can always be brought up.
Yeah. And the thing too, same as with if you get a conditional discharge.
Yeah.
Normally that would drop off.
Yeah.
It doesn't. You have to tell them to do it. And if you don't, it's stuck there. And a lot of people have gotten trapped in that one.
So let's get into...
Can I just finish off? And there's two other parts of the process. There is the community and family group conferencing, and this is the type of process where it brings together family, friends, community members, both the victim and offender, and uses professional facilitators to try and work through and discuss the consequences of the offense. So and identify the outcome that's satisfactory to all parties, right?
You know what's cool about this is I can see where this is utilized. Yeah. And where this is actually being utilized is in domestic abuse situations where the guy or the girl has to go to a course afterwards. Mm-hmm. And they have to sit in front of a conference for anger management, restorative domestic abuse. I think that's exactly what it's called, is restorative domestic abuse program. Yeah. And then also child abuse programs, but not sexual child abuse programs, but physical child abuse programs, right? Yeah.
But the problem with that is, and this is where a lot of the other academic discussion on that goes, is that there's so much of a power imbalance with those kind of relationships. Yeah. How do you rebalance that to try and achieve this kind of a sentencing system, justice system, right?
Yeah. So what I like is that's the theoretical way. However, the way that they're practicing it right now is you have to go see a probation officer. Mm-hmm. This probation officer is then going to say, you're going to these programs, and guess who never gets to go to that program with you? Your victim. And the person who's teaching, you said in that description, it's supposed to be the victim and the offender. Yeah. The victim is never allowed in these programs. And guess who's teaching that program? That teacher for the program is also somebody who works for the probation office. So you now have state in the room.
So let me go further in this one, because this is the restorative justice system process that's been embedded into the criminal justice system in New Zealand. And what they do is the police and courts handle many of the cases. And though instead they use conferencing rather than a harsh punishment, rather than the pain infliction, etc., and all that sort of thing. Though it's used in conjunction with a supervisor or custody order. So there would be a probation, there would be other things that go along at the. But the interesting thing is, and this is a statement that says, a broad array of stakeholders is used in this process as a means of ensuring the offender is held accountable. So we're back to this accountability. What we talk about in addictions is the issue of accountability for our actions, right? And so we get there. The broad array of stakeholders accountable for the offense. In this sense, it can be thought of as a way of tapping into a capacity of non-governmental and or community-based organizations to handle public safety issues. Conferences can be used for cases that have been diverted from police to organizations and community partners who play an important role in monitoring the offender's compliance. with the resolution identified in the conference. And so you kind of go, there's still the state actors involved in this, right? There's still the issue of accountability. There's still that overthought of a threat. But the question is too, are all the proper stakeholders brought into it?
Well, and we see this practiced much more with juvenile court in Canada than I gave two broad strokes of where we see this for adults, but you see this conference thing between parents, probation officer, correction officer, and youth.
Yeah.
That's where you see this conference all the time.
Yeah.
And maybe the judge even.
Yeah. So let's now talking about youth, and let's look at this fourth model. And this is the peer mediation jury. You can think who the peers would be in this case, right?
Yeah.
So this approach basically is about empowering youth leaders, in terms of resolving disputes and or offenses between other youth, other youth and people that they involve. So that's the peer part. It's often done in a school setting, and students are trained to gather information about the offense and those involved, right? It's that peer process, right? I've always actually suggested, when we talk about universities and academic offenses and issues of plagiarism and all these other things, right? And I've always suggested we should actually have a peer court for these, right? And the problem is, though, I've actually heard some of the other ones who they were brutal. They said if the person was copying and they tried to get a better mark than I did and they were cheating, they were going to be brutal on that person. And sometimes the peer lot could be even tougher than what would normally go down.
So I remember as a youth, we used to have peer monitors in my school, right? That's where that came from.
Yeah.
So you would go to a peer monitor before you went to the teacher.
Yeah.
Now, this is so we also see this in treatment centers. Peer policing is what we call it. Like your housemen and stuff like that, more in 3-quarter houses, right? Now, the issue that I found with that was you give too much power to one individual who may not be completely mentally capable of dealing with that responsibility.
You can also get a person who's on a complete and utter power trip and is just going to screw up.
Right.
I'm going to screw you over as best I can.
That's right.
And you go like...
And it's because they didn't like your shoes.
Yeah.
It becomes very, very petty. And this is the problem when you allow sick people to have that kind of power, right?
Yeah. So let's try to take this back to a lot of the stuff now in Canada in terms of these things. We've talked about, restorative justice treats offenders and individuals and presumes, I guess, the actual punishment or threat of punishment is going to change them. And the problem is, if it's a state actor, people have basically thumbed their nose at the state and it's become ineffective. In the same way, public hanging became ineffective.
Well, I also want to paint this picture. How is it that you tell? So, and I think this scenario happens more times than not right now. If we look at drug offenses, okay. So this is the scenario I'll put out there. You have a guy who has been charged with possession, not even possession for the purpose, just possession, and you're now going to, as the state, say I'm the victim. And I'm also the adjudicator. When the addict is sitting there saying, I've been trying to kill myself for as long as I have been using drugs and alcohol, really, and yet you're going to tell me that the way that I want to die is victimizing you, yet I could go to the hospital and be euthanized if I had enough cancer or whatever that could dictate that I was capable of getting euthanized. And at the same time, you're going to tell me you're the victim who's also going to slap my bottom.
We have
it's very hard for any offender, air quotes, to accept that premise.
Let me put that in the jurisprudential theoretical construct. When we see the person is in both the place of the accuser and the judge, we have an old Latin phrase for this. and we say, nemo iudex in sua causa. You can't be a judge in your own cause.
That's right.
And that's where this is if we actually think about it, that's the true failing of the state as an actor in this now,
Yeah.
in the retributive justice system. Whereas now, when the actual accuser now is the direct community,
Yeah.
and those who are directly affected by the offender's actions, then we're starting to reconnect society.
Mm-hmm.
We've created this disconnect by basically washing our hands of it, putting them in a big building, and saying, this is our punishment.
Yeah.
And we're going, it's not working.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but this is where I get, so I just kind of want to get, we can go further down that road, but I keep thinking it comes back to, this whole aspect now has basically colonized these people.
Mm-hmm.
And the question, one could ask the question, who's benefiting? Who's profiting from this? Mm-hmm. We could go down that little rabbit hole.
Well, I mean, I put this out in my blog last week where I said, you take somebody, you put them in an institution. Clinically, a psychologist will say that you are institutionalized within 7 days. You understand the routine that's going on in a jail system or any facility. You understand when you're allowed to eat, when you're allowed to shit, when you're allowed to shower, when you're allowed all of these things, sleep, all of it. And then then the psychologist will say how long it takes for institutionalization to leave a person after they've left the facility. And all psychologists will say it never leaves.
No.
So really when we're talking about punishment, the punishment is the fact that, one, you're away from society, and secondly, you are in an institution that is going to affect you, not just in your mind, but DNA, biochemically, genetically. It is going to alter you because your body, when you go through that kind of trauma of institutionalization, which I think it's one of these things that's like PTSD. We didn't realize how deep PTSD was until just a little while ago. And I think now we're starting to we may be touching upon how detrimental institutionalization really is. Mm-hmm. And really that is, I think, the inherent punishment that comes from being institutionalized that nobody has really looked at. Yeah. And so when you have somebody waiting for bail, for 7 days, right? What do they have just become institutionalized for shoplifting. Now they are carrying this detriment or basically this sentence for life of what it was like and how horrific that institutionalization was in that system, right?
So, but the question I would then say is, the person got nabbed for shoplifting. But why did they have to do that to begin with?
100%.
And that's where we don't get, we basically, we look at the symptom, not the underlying disease. And we're treating, well, as my father is a doctor, and he always said, treat the patient, not the disease.
That's right.
And to me, I would go, shoplifting is but a symptom, but it's not the underlying etiology of what's going on with this person. Well, it's why, you look at a lot of property offenses, right?
Yeah. Basically,
it's guys going in, quick, grab something so I can pay to go and buy the rest of the stuff I need
to survive.
Exactly.
And does the punishment meet the means of the supposed crime? Like that institutionalization, if you consider that as a punishment, does that meet the means of what their so-called, air quote again, crime was? Because in my opinion, that institutionalization is a new form of colonialization in the context that even when you leave, it is still in your brain that it is there.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, I've said personally that I've been on house arrest, and the agoraphobia that had happened after being or going through that bout of house arrest I would have, after all was said and done, I would have rather had gone into the system because I paid for my own cell.
We see this in situations where a person has been institutionalized for mental health and other issues, and that's the only routine and way of life they know. And then when you started to get into care in the community, let's move them into care in the community.
Mm-hmm.
And then
That's
you wonder
right.
why they failed miserably, because you have colonized and institutionalized these people into a set way of life that they don't know how to get out of,
And
because they're stuck. They're stuck in that modal loop. And I want to actually touch on one other thing too, just as a bit. You also have to ask the question of the retributive justice system and the process of inflicting pain for a lot of offenses, which are property offenses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
No.
it's on the lesser scale of things.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and I think that's the other thing is when we look at that community restoration from mental health, they coined a new term called fish out of water syndrome.
Yeah.
So now when you look at the new Mental Health Act in Canada, there is a built-in process of reintegration because they have what's called community therapy.
Yep.
Right? So they don't even go to the institution anymore because they see, and if they do, it's for a very small portion of time. And the portion of time is basically to get them stabilized, to put them back out into the community. And granted, there are some people, and I say this with air quotes, and I'm not trying to be an asshole saying this, who shouldn't be afforded the opportunity, even in mental health, to be back in community because they're at that place where they decide not to take their meds, so on and so forth. Yeah. And therefore, they're on their own recidivative cycle. Yeah. However, the piece that happens with that is they've made the choice not to use their meds. Now the other thing is they have
what I would probably suggest too. One of the issues I would have in seeing this is, and knowing stuff in people who are bipolar, and if they do goof up and start to not take their meds, and they know they can go down that mess. The problem I see is we've also stigmatized these people such that we've isolated them. And if you're going to do care in the community, you can't have the person isolated, because guess what? They're going to go back to the bad habits, and that way, and again, that's where restorative justice creates that connection back to the community, back to the real community.
So I actually looked into mental health out of jail and mental health out of Mental Health Institute here in Alberta. The likelihood of you not returning to a mental health institute is like in the high 80s. Their recidivism rate is like 12%. That is nothing next to when we look at the justice system, which we have turned into a mental health care facility here in Canada for a large portion. So let's also break this down. The mental health hospital here doesn't have many patients. But still, the model of it, the scale, shows that there's less people returning to the hospital, okay? Even with the 200 or 500 patients that they have. Now, when we look at the jail system with all of the schizophrenia, addiction, let's clump it all into a mental health issue, okay? We're seeing on a good year, 94% recidivism rate. As much as restorative justice is not about recidivism, in my opinion, when you deal with the behavioral issues, the recidivism rate will drop regardless because they actually understand the consequences of their action.
So let's then ask two questions. First, what is mental health doing differently that they have like a 12% recidivism rate? And also, if we then think now to the criminal justice system and back to that where we have 94% recidivism rate, and most of them are people dealing with addictions and mental health, one can see the interesting irony that we also have them hooked on this system as well.
That's right. That's right.
Think about
I mean,
we've got them hooked not on just drugs, we've got you hooked on a system.
So So I'm going to just drop this in here about restorative justice models that we have here in Canada.
And there's a lot of stuff out in BC and Vancouver that gets interesting, yeah.
So one, the way how the justice model is, so what the court prescribes, okay, is community service.
Yep.
So community service is done all of the time for fine option, which means you can't afford your $2,800 fine because you couldn't afford your insurance. So they're going to give you a bunch of community service in order to pay that debt.
You're going to work it off per day.
That's right. Or you can do time for it,
yeah,
which is $108 a day for every day that you're in jail.
And most of the time, those guys are doing it on weekends, and then they get there on the Friday, they get there on the Friday. Oh, sorry, we're full up.
But see, see you later. This is the thing. You lose your dignity when you have to bend over and smile, and I don't mean with your face.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's really the cost there. Next is drug court. So drug court is a great program. However, the differences between Canada and America is you have to plead guilty, and you will have a guilty at the end of your program date. Yeah. So you finish the program, you still have the record. They say you served 1 day in jail for the entire thing. Yeah. However, you still have a record. It's not stayed and forgiven. Yeah. That doesn't happen in Canada.
And our whole pardon system's now messed up, and it keeps it that way.
That's right. So then the next one that we have is probation, house arrest. So probation is a piece of restorative justice as well, because you may not have to do time in jail. They just allow you to do your time within the community by seeing a probation officer saying that you don't have what's called unnormative community behaviors.
Yeah.
Okay. Then house arrest means you're basically going to pay for your cell, and you get to stay in your house and not have to go to jail.
Yeah. Unnormative behaviors, actually in the UK, they refer to that as antisocial behaviors.
Yeah.
And ASBOs and things. Yeah.
Then the next one is parole, which is a federal system.
Yeah.
So if you ever hear probation, that means you probably have a summary conviction or a hybrid federal indictable offense, which is a brand new thing that we have here in Canada. That is the equivalent of a felony B in America.
Yep.
Which gives a judge an option to go high on the scale or low on the scale, but there's still a minimum mandatory involved that they cannot mess with. Okay, they can't go less than the minimum mandatory.
Yeah.
That's how it works in America. Here in Canada, the judge does not have that option on a hybrid. They have to give you the minimum mandatory. There's nothing more and nothing less.
And again, we're back to that state imposing this as a sanction in terms of that's how we vindicate and inflict pain.
That's right.
But does it work?
That's right. And then so we have parole, which is usually after a federal sentence, which means you may have to do, so let's look at a 3-year sentence. Federally, you may have to do 9/8 of your sentence, which is about 18, 20 months. Then from 18 to 20 months, you are then allowed to go to annex, which means day parole. You're still living on the annex of the penitentiary. However, you're allowed to commute into the community and work. Then from there, you will get parole. And then from parole, you get to go to your home community. And from your home community, you then can go and participate in work, so on and so forth, and be declassified to a minimum security risk.
Yeah.
So that's an actual integration system.
Yeah.
That happens. The integration from the federal system. The provincial integration system is probation that does not afford you any housing. It just puts you on the street at 2/3 of your sentence. So if you have a 2-year sentence, you will be also put on the street at 18 months. And your last 4 months, you're going to have to see probation.
So you're back in the community with no housing, no support. And what are you going to do?
Exactly. Right?
You're going to go back to old habits.
Then we have diversion court, which we talked about.
Yeah.
However, let's classify diversion court and drug court into you have to have certain prerequisites in order to get into that restorative justice model.
Yeah.
Drug court being you're no longer allowed possession for the purpose.
Yeah.
So possession for the purpose here for Americans means this. They suspect you of trafficking. They haven't really caught you trafficking, but you have a quantity that dictates that you are trafficking, and they may have conducted surveillance on you that would also classify you as a trafficker.
Yeah.
Now, possession still doesn't get you into drug court.
Yeah.
Trafficking gets you into drug court, which means here in Canada, you actually sold drugs to an undercover cop.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, I mean, what are police here in Canada? They are essentially professional witnesses. And they're going to go on the stand and say, yes, this guy sold me drugs, so on and so forth. So they've got you dead to rights.
Yeah.
And that's how you get into drug court, which means that the conviction, even if you plead guilty, you can't fight it because they pretty much have you dead to rights.
And you have to plead guilty.
That's right. Possession for the purpose, you can't plead guilty on that because your lawyer cannot sit in court because the essence
the essence of the crime, they haven't proven yet.
That's right. And your lawyer cannot sit in court and allow you to perjure yourself saying, yes, I'm guilty of possession for the purpose beyond a shadow of a doubt.
And just so people know, that puts us lawyers in a very awkward position because then we have to, as an officer of the court, we have to recuse ourselves.
That's right.
And guess what that then implies to the judge?
That's right.
And it's like
there's a lie.
Yeah, exactly. And everybody figures out what's really going on.
That's right.
Yeah.
So those are the current models that we're using. Now, I'm going to read out quick facts, statistics of what has come from this. In 2013, drug offense stats per capita on 100,000 people in Canada was 300 drug offenses. Now,
I find that a little hard to...
I'm going to disprove this.
Yeah.
So Van Du in Vancouver came out with their study. In 2017, there were 2,219 heroin possession charges. That's not possession for the purpose, who could still be an addict.
Yeah.
And that's not trafficking charges, who could still be an addict.
Yeah.
These are just people who had a gram to maybe 5 grams of heroin in their pocket.
Yeah.
In 2017, it was 2,219. In 2017, there were 8,996 meth possession charges. Okay?
Mm-hmm. That sounds a little bit more realistic.
In 2010, for meth only, there was 1,523, which far exceeds the 300 drug offenses that Stats Canada came out with on the per capita of 100,000 people. So if we could use that as a quantification of what restorative justice is yielding us, it's yielding us higher amounts of drug offenses, higher amounts of property offenses because they will be clumped in to drug offenses
because of the cycle. Yeah.
We'll also see shoplifting, right? We will also see fraud. Right? We will see all of these things happen. Now, the other issue that I have is provincially, we have never invested in a restorative justice cycle, and we actually incentivize people to go federal because there's a program for somebody to be reintegrated into the system through the federal, through the federal. My whole piece in my blog last week was essentially, why is it that we incentivize people to go to a federal system as opposed to dealing with them in a summary or misdemeanor conviction? It makes much more sense to utilize restorative justice in a behavioral sense at a minimal capacity as opposed to allowing it to fester into something that becomes felony or indictable in Canada. It just doesn't make any damn sense that we do not come in saying, let's segue you and exploit diversion court to accept more. We just don't do it. Instead, we utilize the colonialization of crime and punishment. And then what's never sought after as a guy who's been in the system, that the institutionalization of being in that place alone is punishment. The fact that you can only call your lawyer once a day and your mom maybe once a day and one other person once a day, because you're only allowed 3 phone calls in Canada prior to being convicted for free, that is not considered a punishment. The fact that you can't eat what you want to eat is not considered a punishment. These are not models of punishment towards the people such as the guards and staff and corrections who are running those places. Instead, they impose upon you their form of punishment on top of them oversighting the fact that institutionalization is a punishment in itself.
But again, we're back to the state being the actor
That's
in place
right.
of the victim. Not so you've disconnected from who
That's
your
right.
real victims are,
That's right.
and also, therefore, you never then start to acknowledge your actions and your role and your behaviors and your activities. And
That's right.
you're always seeing, everything is against you.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, so it perpetuates this sort of thing. Now, it's interesting you talk about the stuff in BC. I just want to read this a little bit in terms of restorative justice practices. They actually have Vancouver area practitioners do have a longer history of dealing with a lot of this stuff in terms of implementing restorative justice practices. A lot of this is seen basically because in BC, the higher levels of Indigenous communities where we can then draw from on this. For example, almost all Vancouver area respondents, and this was one of the studies, receive referrals from local police, the RCMP, corrections department, court systems, in addition to schools and organizations out there. And it says, perhaps unsurprising given the findings that 70% of Vancouver area respondents reported receiving at least half of their funding from regional, provincial, or federal government sources. This was not the case with, and they were talking about the Chicago process. So the question is becoming now really where they're doing stuff depending on where they're getting the funding. So the question that you posed earlier about this, forcing more into the federal side, because there are more programs, because there could be more money there.
Mm-hmm.
It's follow the money, Luke. Follow the money, right?
100%.
And this is, you kind of go. It's almost like the provincial side's passing the buck back to the feds. But the feds haven't cottoned on to, wait a second, really, if we really did get into proper, true restorative justice systems, we actually could lower our costs.
Well, and
that's where that's where the final piece of this puzzle becomes, right?
So I'll two-prong this. About 70% of the province's money for corrections comes from the federal from the federal budget. So the federal government is actually paying for the provincial institutions.
Yeah.
However, the provinces are not instituting anything that's restorative. They're not instituting anything that's integrative. They're not instituting anything that is in corrective behavioral measures. At least in Alberta, we do not see it.
No.
We also don't see it so much in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario. We kind of see it.
But we are seeing it in BC because of the moves by the Indigenous communities
100%.
out there. They're pushing this whole aspect. And I think, and this is going to sound very interesting for a lot of people who know me, is I would actually suggest that we could learn a hell of a lot from our Indigenous community and how we handle stuff in society. They've gone through such a mess. They're starting to, I think they're starting to get us to realize the aspect of tribe and community is very much important in our society. We've gotten away from that. We've gone too individualistic, too isolated.
Yeah.
And that, again, the isolation of people from, not on reserves and everything else, that's where a lot of them start to mess up. You can start to see those little parts. I think we could learn a hell of a lot from Indigenous spirituality in terms of how they've approached stuff.
Well,
and I think that becomes part and parcel of what goes on in the circles and a lot of the aspect of bringing that community back to that individual, and all sides starting to realize the harms they're causing, not to others, but to themselves.
Now, I know in the beginning of the show you had brought up New Zealand.
Yeah.
So I'm going to also refer to another country that has taken restorative justice and the models that we've kind of talked about in a whole new and massive way, and they've had a lot of light, and that's Portugal.
And they've gone very radical, and the effects have been astounding.
Amazing. now this is the thing that I think is the biggest misconception, that people who think about Portugal, they're like, oh, well, they decriminalized drugs, but they didn't just do that. So I'm gonna just break down a couple facts of some of the stuff that I've looked up about Portugal. And one is, even in the face of their serious financial issues back in 2010, they had received a $115 billion bailout by the U.S. from the World Monetary Fund.
Yeah.
They still did not cut the services or sacrifice any funding from their mental health funding.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why. Because from 92 up to this point, what they saw an 18% right away in the reduction of health costs and overdose deaths, but also the legal system saw another 18% decrease in its costs with drug charges. The production in loss and income had also raised by 18 to 20% because people no longer were in jail.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the other piece to this, so yes, they decriminalized drugs to a personal amount, which doesn't mean that you can walk around with heroin of 10 grams. It means that you can walk around with 5 or less. But what they also did was, and this is what's starkly strange for me being a Canadian, because this is very similar to what we have. However, we have a massive epidemic. So the decriminalization is not just a fix, but it was necessary to give timely support. Now, this is where Canada fails.
And this is where we also fail with the drug injection sites and everything else. Yes, we can bring you back, we can give you Narcan and everything else, but we don't have the rest of those support around you to sort of say, okay, has your life become unmanageable? Have you had enough? Do you want to finally... Yeah.
Let's break those 3 models down. One is access to outpatient services. We have an abundance of that in Canada. Abundance. There's a counselor that you can see at any given time, anywhere in Canada. I don't give a shit if you're in a remote area or if you're in a massive city. There is teleconferencing. There's a whole bunch of stuff for addictions that you can get in touch with an addictions counselor that's completely free of service. Also, there's time and detox. We have free detox in Canada. However, we're shrinking. We're seeing in the Edmonton model, this time shrinking. So we used to give 7 days in detox. Now, because of the proportions of our epidemic, we only see 3 days for those who are on stimulant use, which is methamphetamine and cocaine. If you're on fentanyl or opiates, we only give you 4 days now, and then you're out. The other piece to this is Portugal will give you up to 3 years in treatment. We don't even come close to that in Canada. Anywhere in Canada. There's a couple models, like we have, and I'll put a shout out here to Recovery Acres and also to Simon House down in Calgary. Simon House has almost a full year. Same thing with Fresh Start. I'll give a shout out to them as well. Fresh Start has a full year with a reintegrative housing process that they have a part of that treatment center. There's another one too in Calgary, a female program that does it. With the reintegrated process. I'm not going to say their name because they're highly trauma-based and they already get a ton of phone calls. Simon House has a reintegrative process as well and these are mostly male programs, with housing. It's also it runs about a year, but 3 months intensive. And then you have Recovery Acres here in the Edmonton area that also has 3 months intensive, and then the rest of the year is in reintegrative housing. However, all 3 of these places are not ran by the Alberta government. All 3 of these places are not for profits. So they're actually community ran, which is fine. It's a great model. However, the ability for them to be able to give this service is only, I think they take in 100 clients. That's 300 people. Right? Between all 3 of them.
But the idea is for them to go longer in treatment, same as Portugal. You know, I recollect Craig Ferguson when he was talking about a sobriety story, and he was talking about, you know, down the States, it's like, you get like 28 days in treatment, right? And you're good and done, right? And he's going like horse crap, right? You know, and he said, well, the only reason why it's 28 days is that's all your HMO will give you in terms of funds, right?
That's right.
And so it's it goes back to the problems of the money, right?
So, and I also think the Prime Minister who brought the decriminalization of drugs into Portugal. This is his famous statement, which I think should be the concept of really how we look at this drug epidemic. It says, the first goal is to help people to resume their dignity. And also he said, an addict has to do whatever to get his or her fix each day. We cannot ask him or her to behave as a free citizen, because when they're in the throes of addiction, they are not free. Yeah. We're not free from the decisions that we make when we're in active addiction. They are decisions that will live with us for the rest of our lives, just as the institutionalization that we have gone through by going through jail.
Yeah. And again, you're not free if you've been colonialized through a jail system and through addictions.
That's right.
But basically, you then look at the criminal justice system as still perpetuating that. And I go back to, I think there are some tweaks and better forms of restorative justice where we can then say, well, instead of, and again, we're back to the issue of the state isn't the victim. We're actually go back to the real victim. And, I know there's many on the right who would say, well, who would disagree with me on this and say, well, wait a second, no, the other real victim is the addict.
That's right.
But the addict can't play that victim card anymore.
That's right.
We also know that problem
That's
as well.
Right.
And so what we have is a system that still perpetuates this. And again, back to your example too, you're that odd person out and we're going, wait a second, what did we do differently? And then how do we then create a process for others to follow that could do this?
So I want to backtrack just a little bit. I think there's also a piece too that the addict has to acknowledge who they victimized.
Yeah.
Because the reality is how do you explain to somebody, one, who's being held by their victim, the state, they're being adjudicated to by the state, who's apparently also their victim, yet in the back of their mind, and I said this earlier in the show, the only idea that they have as a victim in life is them. And the reason why they think that is because they cannot see the disease of addiction will not allow you to see, because of the delusion that addiction is, to see the catastrophes that you have created around you.
So think about all the rest of these systems perpetuating
That's
that.
right.
And again, it goes, but we perpetuate it, I think, because we have colonialized
That's
people
right.
into these institutions.
That's right.
And we can't get, and I think the Portugal model is something I think Canada has to look further at.
Well,
yeah, we've gone part way decriminalizing it, but
marijuana, yes.
Yeah.
Well,
but
we've legalized marijuana, yeah.
Or as they would say in the UK, okay, wait a second, what about the Class A drugs? And what about the other things? There's all sorts of addictions. And I think if we can actually get to trying and looking at the further parts of the treatment parts that Portugal did, I think everyone say, well, that would be extra cost. No, wait. By the time we start saving the costs of the revolving door and institutionalizing this colonialized system, those monies actually further shift back to the treatment side. But then if you actually are a proper economist and then you start to look at what would happen in the shift over time, your costs would shift from institutionalization to treatment. Mm-hmm. And then you say, oh, wait a second, what's happening to these people? They're starting to find normal again. They're starting to be part of society and a community.
Yeah.
What are they doing? They're working. They're helping. They're starting rather than them being the other side. So you start to shift your costs and things start to improve overall.
We also create a new taxpayer base.
Yes.
That is no longer, Portugal said it, right?
Yeah.
We no longer they had a reduction in loss of income and loss of production from people who were not serving time in jail.
Yeah.
Now also, so we heard that statement from the Prime Minister of Portugal, right? So I believe, and you brought this up of who the victim is earlier in the podcast, and this was the note that I wrote down, was the victim is lost upon the doctors and the lawyers. Because as they're sitting there across the table from an addict, the doctors themselves, I think, are having a difficult time to justify that an addict is a victim.
Yeah.
And I think lawyers, because they're looking at, like, especially a crown attorney, is looking at the supposed actions that they have committed in their addiction, when really this is a cry for help.
Yeah.
Now, can the Portugal system be retrofitted in Canadian law? Well, what I would suggest is we could retrofit it in the context of a commitment. And that's like a mental health commitment. The court system itself, as opposed to imposing a judiciary and saying, we don't accept these behaviors, they then instead say, look, if a psychologist, and the new Mental Health Act says that it takes a psychologist and a doctor to say that somebody is not of sound mind and capacity in order to be subject to commitment. We could see that with somebody who has serious methamphetamine use. It looks like schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Okay. We can also see this with fentanyl now, and we're starting to see dope psychosis from cocaine.
Exactly. And I was going to say, these deeper psychosis issues and psychopathy are endemic into this. But I think your point about the doctors and lawyers not seeing who the victims are, I think the problem is every little person, or every person who's part of this process, only sees the little bit in front of them. And I think the harder part is to be able to step back and start to get a 45,000, 60,000 foot view of all the interactions of this process.
That's right.
And that's a skill that very few people can have. And that's why when you start to then sort of say, wait a second, why don't we look at this as we've colonized these people as your starting point, then all the other little parts should fall into place of what we've done to further perpetuate these problems.
So I was engaged in a conversation with somebody over the weekend where we were talking about this, and they said, well, what's the solution? I said, well, there's two schools of thought, and I've thought about this over the last week because I knew that this was coming up. And I said, this is one thought. You could get health justice and Alberta Works, or like our welfare system here in Canada, to all sit down at a table and create a brand new mandate. However, you and I both know, being very intimate with government and policy, that would take forever for them.
Each empire would have to give up something.
And they would all have to, have the premise that what they're doing is not working. And the three of them coming together now have to create whose responsibilities are this. And for you and I, it's easy. I mean, welfare system pays for housing, the healthcare system pays for treatment, and justice segues them into it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you and I, it's easy to see that. However, the reality of the dogma of politics just won't allow those three things to happen. So then the next thing that I segue...
So maybe we should actually get the politicians out of the... tell them to get the hell out of the way.
So then what I thought to myself was, what are the tools that we have that are available to us? And one of them, 100%, is commitment.
Yeah.
The lawyers themselves, this is where mental health and justice come together, is in a commitment capacity. So if you have a psychologist or psychiatrist and a doctor who's assessing people coming in and they're fucking crazy as crazy, and they do a drug screening on them and they fail methamphetamine in the urine test, they fail certain drugs.
Yeah.
That psychologist and doctor could say, why don't we take the therapeutic justice approach? Why don't we commit this person to go into mental health hospital for a short period of time till we stabilize them, then give them the opportunity to make a decision if they want to go to treatment or not.
Now, you did say something earlier on about the political interplay and the bureaucrats in this. And I think why this isn't going to happen, or why it isn't happening at this stage, is for this one simple reason. I think you pointed out, maybe we should reiterate this, that these people in these on these processes now would now have to admit something.
Oh yeah.
They would have to admit what we're doing isn't working.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
And if they can't do that, you're not going to move forward.
And yet it's a stark reality when you look at the stats from Van Du talking about drug offenses just in 2017. From 2010 to 2017, yet Stats Canada will come up with some bullshit number of 300 drug offenses on 100,000 per capita Canadians. And that is with marijuana included in that stat.
Yeah.
That it's
And
so
now
preposterous.
because that's taken out of the equation with
100%.
decriminalization.
So now they're saying something like 50. They are insane. And I think this is, the political discourses. This is how far away, I don't give a shit if it's conservative or liberal, how far away they really are from the mark of where society is.
Yeah.
They don't see it. And also, like I said, readily at our tool case in the legal system, a commitment is far more superior to somebody going through the process that way than it is for somebody to be going through the judicial system that just has so many barriers and is conducive towards a recidivism cycle that nobody actually really gets the help that's necessary for their behavioral issues. Also, with a commitment, there's less stigma involved because you do not have to disclose to anybody that you've been committed to a hospital. However, you can be compelled to disclose to somebody that you have possession for the purpose charges, or you have trafficking charges, or you have possession charges. You are compelled, or property charges. And then you have to then say, well, I was an addict, blah, 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 blah. And the person looking at you is like, fuck you.
Yeah.
There's that stigma.
Yeah.
So how do we get past that? And sure, there's a stigma about going to commitment. However, you do not have to disclose that. And they can't just readily go on Google, punch in your name like Justin Robert, and then see that I went to a commitment in a hospital. It doesn't happen that way. And then you're actually coupled with people who understand mental health issues. You could also use the curative discharge piece coupled with the commitment as well, and utilize that as its own drug court with less restrictiveness in order to get into it. See, it opens it up, right? Because now you're looking at behaviors. You're no longer looking at actions.
So let me take this whole concept. We understand the stigmatization of what's going on. So can we also look at stigma as a further way of colonializing the person?
100%.
There you go.
100%.
You see, the whole thing, I keep saying, the whole thing is fitting together. And it's the problem is, though, how do we take now from what we can understand what's going on into a proper process where we can actually start to actually solve some of these things? But again, it comes back to some of these people would have to admit what they're doing isn't working. They'd have to admit to colonializing this segment of society.
And I think...
And that we'd have to then admit that we have stigmatized, despite the fact that we started to say, we shouldn't have a stigma to mental health and addictions. The problem is, though, those aspects, I think, of our society have gotten worse and worse, say definitely in the past 10 years.
And
so we've got it. It's getting for it. It's going to reach a point where it's going to meet a critical mass, and someone's going to have to say, you're right. We have gone down a wrong road, and now we can.
You know what, though? I see two ventures in this. One, why is it that it's difficult for somebody to admit their wrongs? It's usually because they're afraid that the other person's going to go, aha,
pride.
See?
And pride.
That's right.
And pride.
So those two things coupled makes it difficult for a government or an entity to do that. Yep. Now, also, I think that, or what I would suggest is that we as a society need to stop the and just let them do what they got to do. Yeah. Also, if we keep going the way that we're going, I see this as addictive Darwinism. And I think there is a place where government elites, because like I said, there is a huge barrier to where they live and where we live, to recognize that we need to care about these people who are dying from addiction because, they live in wherever they live,
And we saw that mentality in the past year or so with everybody screaming and hollering about the fentanyl crisis.
100%.
And going, we must do something, and it was, I looked at it and I said, it was almost like becoming a caricature of a Yes Minister episode where we have to do something. That is something, Minister, therefore we must do it. And I'm going like, okay, that's nice, but...
What's the yield?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the other thing too, is that we have to recognize, or these elites, air quotes, have to recognize that they're meddling in something they don't understand, and they need to allow people who come from that community to actually have a serious input of what's going on. Now, also, when you were talking about this restorative justice piece, you were talking about community.
Yeah,
we have community.
But the thing is with restorative justice is we're talking about what is the true community.
That's right.
And the people, I would even sort of, I hate to, sound very sort of, professor-esque here, but, I'd actually have to quote Lord Atkin in the Donahue, in the Donahue and Stevenson case where we were talking about negligence. And he said basically, who is who then is affected by my acts or acts and omissions when I called into question. Mm-hmm. This is part of the definition we use of negligence, and I think it's a very apt quote where he was trying to say, who is my neighbor? Mm-hmm. Those who are so closely affected by my acts or acts and omissions. And that's the connection with the community.
That's right.
And that's why I say some of these indigenous circles work far better. But the thing is, you have to go that step further of now who also is, it's not just the person harmed as the victim, but also the person is victimizing themselves by their addictions.
That's right.
And they have to start to hit that step one.
So,
that's where if you can then use these circles to get that person to then hit their step one, then you can go down that road of now we know we need that support for treatment, which Portugal is doing, which we're not.
So I want to.
We're kind of it's like with all these little bits, we're kind of like jumping around the edge of the reality, but we're not actually jumping right into it.
Yeah.
And why? Because the bureaucrats and the rest of in the whole criminal justice system would have to admit
that it's not working.
We're screwing up.
Now, the other thing is that we haven't gotten into about Portugal that I think will frame this better.
Yeah.
Is they made it a privilege to go to jail. Okay? It's a privilege. Mm-hmm. They do not enable you to fuck up on the street and then go to jail. Yeah. Instead, what they do is they turn you back out to the street where they will not enable you by giving you welfare. They will not enable you by giving you all of the health care that's necessary. The only things that they will give you as an opportunity is saying, well, we're not going to get, like here in Alberta, we give $406 a month for every human being for welfare. And they won't give you that. Yeah. They'll instead give you $100. Yeah. And they'll allow you to sleep in the shelters, right? And then you go in front of a council who basically dictates, yes, your behaviors are conducive with addiction. Do you want to go to treatment? And they say no. Yeah. Turn them back out, and they take a picture. So you want to see a step one. Imagine you started coming to the council in your early active use, kicked out, all that stuff, 180 pounds. Yeah. 4 months later, you're now 150 pounds, and you have no access to money. You have very little access to, you have access to healthcare so that you don't die. Yeah. However, you don't have access to knee braces and all the extra benefits, right?
Yeah.
It's not about classifying you or giving you less than. It's about saying we are not going to enable your actions any longer.
So let me put this at you in terms of my overall theory here. Do we think then that this retributive justice system is further enabling these addictive behaviors? It's further enabling the colonialization.
100%.
There you go.
I mean, 100%.
Every little bit starts to fit back together, right?
If we go back to that classic thinking of what's that catchphrase of psychology? Everybody thinks that it's like reverse psychology.
Yeah.
right? That's what I'm looking for. We
Yeah.
go to that thinking of reverse psychology. Everybody thinks that jail is a shitty place to go.
Yeah.
Okay, let's flip that.
Yeah.
Let's make it a privilege, and we start turning jails like Portugal did into treatment centers.
Yeah.
That's what we do. This way, it's a privilege
But
for
it's
people to go and seek
But
help.
it's a privilege finally to get help. But you can only do it as long as that person now says, "Yeah, my life is now unmanageable."
That's right.
And that you have to you have to get them to that step where they have to completely truly find their true bottom, and you can't enable it. And I think what I would also suggest in this is those who've been in Al-Anon and stuff would probably understand all these other enabling behaviors are part and parcel of this colonialization.
That's right.
That we still enable this process
Yeah.
in order to keep you there and control you.
Well, and this is the only hole that I see that I think somebody would say we're wrong. And I'm going to put it out there is that if we did this, there would be far more crime. Now, this is what I suggest. There's crime anyways.
Yeah.
And guess what? It's growing.
Mm-hmm.
Right now it's growing with the model that we have in place. And the only model that we can see that says that they lost 18% right away is Portugal.
Yeah.
So to say, we have to say all is lost at this point and recognize that it can't get any worse than it is.
But you see, then we look at it and say, oh, wait a second, yes, crime is growing, therefore we must be tougher on crime. And you go, wait a second, no, what's the real root of the criminal behavior? Now, I would also, I know there's some people out there who would probably like me to get into discussions about, well, what's the aspect of poverty playing into the role of addictions and everything else too,
of course, yeah.
and the hopelessness and the helplessness and that
Sure.
that sort of thing, But the problem is, then again, if we did that and we started saying, well, we give them a guaranteed income system. Are we back to enabling?
Well, I'll put it to you this
rather
way.
than
We
dealing
have
with
that.
Yeah.
We have that. And guess what? We have welfare and we have like AISH here in Alberta, which is like for people who have it's disability, basically for life. We have that, and people aren't chasing their fucking dreams. What they're doing is they're getting high, right? So the reality is this. A universal income, in my opinion, won't fit at this point.
Now, I would say that's not the case for all those on Asian stuff. There are there are disabilities. It's we're only dealing with small segment.
I agree.
Right?
I agree. However, the segment with welfare is a larger portion of that where people are using. And so what I would suggest is they should only be entitled to a universal income provided they have found their purpose. That needs to be the qualification. The qualification should not be, I can't find employment because I'm a junkie. That's not the qualification to go and get welfare and social assistance. It shouldn't be, yet at this point it is, right?
That gets back to my my statement earlier. What's the symptom? What's the disease?
That's right. I totally agree. And also, I would suggest that we would be better served if secondary school was incorporated in this universal income.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that is because, we look at people who went to school and they went to school to become a pharmacist or whatever. And this touches in on what I had said last month with mothers and AI and all this stuff. We've lost we're going to be losing a lot of occupancies. And because of that, now when we have students going to university, you don't ask them what they want to do. You ask them what they want to learn now, because that's what's going to benefit them the most in life. Yeah. It's not about what you want to do. It's about what you want to learn. And so,
but we're actually getting into I know this would get into a bit of a tangent and stuff, but we're getting into this modality in post-secondary where we're tying programs and funding to jobs and income.
Yes.
And the metric, I'll say this in part of the discussions I had last week with a whole bunch of people in this area, the metrics in terms of trying to understand that are actually missing. There's gaps in the metrics, and the whole thing is a complete and utter farce in terms of where things are going. And the idea too, when we're teaching in university, I've always said, and I've told this to my students all the time, we're trying to teach you skills and things you need to know for jobs we haven't described yet.
That's right.
And I think there's one part of the process of the whole. I guess I'm trying to find a word for it to describe the whole continuity of it. Is that I think one of our failings in that whole system is that we people have no creativity.
Yeah.
And the creative aspect is being taken out of a lot of the stuff in terms of where things are going. And I think, and that way, people don't have problem-solving skills. They don't have creative business skills. To come up with new businesses, to come up with new ideas. Well, I think we're going to see like the Elon Musks and the ideas and stuff that come from him are going to be rare.
Yeah. Well,
because of these things. But now tie it back to, well, why? Because we've gotten a society that's gotten so messed up.
Yeah.
Because of the addictions, because of the, they don't have the hope, they don't have the thing. So therefore, they're just trying to eke out a living rather than trying to think of what do you want to do.
Well, and I think this is the tie, is the government, who conglomerately runs education as well as healthcare here in Canada, they're looking at it as taxpayer yield.
Yeah.
They're not looking at it as what's beneficial for the person's individual or the person's feelings. Mm-hmm. They're looking at it as what is the tax yield. So when you're talking about school, they're, like you said, they couple it with what is the upcoming industry, and that's how they train the kids coming through school. It's an indoctrination now.
And okay, the one problem, though, just to understand, in post-secondary and with the education system is, if you think like that, and you try to say, okay, this is what's going to be needed, by the time you get around to putting all the programs and classes and courses in place needed to hit that need, you completely changed.
Yeah.
And the whole system, it's like trying to turn an aircraft carrier on a dime. You can't do it. And businesses realize this, and the government doesn't realize what the businesses are actually trying to tell them is that we need these certain, but the problem is they can't turn on a dime to come back. And so I'm of the opinion that instead of trying to teach them very specific skills, actually, I think there is something to be said about a classical liberal arts degree where you get to understand bits of different things, but you have that creative mindset that you now have a broad view of the society and the world to draw on for problem solving, for creating ideas. And you don't, when you take that sort of liberal arts out, and everyone say, oh no, liberal arts is, airy fairy shit, right? And I'm going, no, it isn't. I'm actually a product of that whole thing, where I studied all sorts of different things, and then I have students go like, how do you know this? How do you? Because I've gone and researched and learned it. And that's what gives me, I think, the ability to start to see this bigger 45,000 foot view of things, and I can see things that others can't because we've drawn on and we've taken out amongst this group now that ability to be that creative.
And I think that whole thought or idea of the taxpayer is the reason why we've missed the mark with restorative justice and addiction and behavioral issues. I mean, there's a stark difference between an addict and a murderer. Okay, and there's also a difference between a murderer and somebody who's committed murder.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody who's committed murder may have murdered once.
Yeah.
Somebody who's committed murders. That's a behavioral issue we will never get past, or a sexual offense, which is very difficult to get past as well.
Yeah,
however,
the serial murderers like John Wayne Gacy and all the rest, like people still try to
Paul
fathom.
Bernardo.
Yeah, Paul Bernardo, and people still try to fathom what was going on, and we still don't understand.
So if we use the taxpayers' dollars saying, that's such a small portion of society, really, we're okay with them being in jail. Honestly, we're okay with that. However, the tax-paying dollars that are being wasted on addictions, property charges, or let's call them offenses that are addictive, behavioral, conducive.
And economic crimes.
That's right, which is also, if we want to put possession for the purpose or trafficking also in an economic view, it's also in there as well. The reality is we need the tax-paying dollar to yield that population to give us tax-paying dollars back. This way, it's a recyclable amount of money as opposed to just a detriment of money. Because as we're throwing money out, and we're seeing a yield of, what was it here? Something like we're seeing a yield of 2,219 heroin possession charges in 20. That's the yield of us spending how much money we're spending for restorative justice and the models that we have. This is not worth what we're putting into.
Okay, so let me throw out something now. And I think a lot of my right-wing friends are going to cringe about what I'm going to say. But if we start to then say that all of these views are a group that are taking a very blinkered economic, monetary view of what they're trying to do, and I would then suggest Karl Marx was right in terms of the economic effects of laws.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting. You know, he was square on about the effects of rules in terms of what we're doing. And, you know, Marx and Engels were right on this.
And if we take a look at a capitalistic view in utilizing this group of people who have been colonialized, saying, let's put them to work, right?
Yeah.
Let's get our money back. Let's invest in commitment sentencing. Let's invest in therapeutic justice. Let's invest in these things, and let's use what we have and turn it around. Then all of a sudden, we have now put colonialism back into that whole Marxist, that whole idea of what that is doing, because it's really classed them and put them into an imperialistic state.
Now, I'm going to dangle something out there, and I'm going to maybe put this out there for something later. But if we then start to say, hey, you know, in terms of this classical economic view, in terms of a capitalistic sense, you know, and everyone then goes and starts talking about Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations and talks about, okay. I was talking with a colleague when we were driving back from Athabasca last week, and he actually knows this, and he says he teaches it about it as well. And I said, everyone talks about Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations and pure capitalism and all this way of making money and having that pure economic view of things. But people don't realize that Adam Smith also wrote another piece called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is the circumscribed aspect of Wealth of Nations. It's a surrounding part to Wealth of Nations. And he actually thought Theory of Moral Sentiments was the more important piece. And that whole piece starts to talk about these, yes, pure capitalism making money, but it's what you do with it, it's how you work with it, and the effect on the individual and the people, and how they go about making decisions for the greater community. And that I'm going to dangle out there as maybe something to discuss later in terms of the broader societal aspects of this. But when you start to get back to it, this imperialistic sort of aspect and stuff and the effects of things, I would say, yeah, Karl was right in terms of the effect on it. The question is now, how do we then fix this?
And I actually believe that the remedy is capitalistic venture.
Yeah.
We just have to look at what we're selling, buying, and trading in a new way.
Yeah.
Because what we were doing is we were buying, selling, and trading punishment in order to rehabilitate, air quotes, behaviors.
And
this is not working. This is not working. No. What does seem to work is we endorse choice in order for somebody to come to a place where they're willing to change their behaviors on their own through the supports that the state can provide. Provided that the state changes their view in who the victim really is.
Yes.
You have to look at the addict as the victim so they can recognize who they victimized. Because if the offender cannot recognize who they victimized, all is lost. They're just going to do it again.
And that's where the true aspect of that community involvement as the stakeholders and the restorative justice comes into play to force that part to then change to hit the next domino, which is back to the individual offender.
And if we look at what we already have, and like I said, I looked at not what we need to do to change. I looked at what we have already accessible. Mm-hmm. We have AA meetings. We have CA meetings, and guess what they are? Those are the groups of society who will hold account to those people who need to make retribution to society.
Yeah.
Because it's an honor to be anywhere in a public forum and say, I am a member of an anonymous organization.
They're a variation upon a theme of restorative justice circles.
That's right.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's an hour 45.
Wow.
So
is that your longest show then?
It's one of them, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of them. So I thank you for coming in. Any of the guests who have questions, so on and so forth, or you want to get a hold of Liam, hit me up on the website, Twitter, or Instagram. And where those places are is, if you're looking for the After the Show blog, you can go to www.lifeonlifestermspodcast.com. You can also get us at Life on Life's Terms Podcast, one word, on Instagram, and we'll get our weekly clips there. You can also check us out on Facebook, and that will also have a link to the blog and the show. We're on YouTube, anywhere you get podcasts, we're probably there as well. You can get Chelsea on Twitter at Chelsea_Life on Life's Terms blogger, and she's also on Instagram. She's one of our wonderful, wonderful creators. Please hit that subscribe button, share and like, and send it to all your friends. And hopefully this episode will get those juices tantalized and moving on.
So I'd like to thank you for having me back on again. It's actually a joy to come in, and I hope we have given people a lot of things to think about, or as I would use the elongated English word, cogitate on. There you go.
Have a beautiful afternoon, guys, and we will talk to you on the next show. Bye for now.
Bye.